Hey everyone, welcome back. As I promised, I'm going to try to wrap up chapter 2 today and also in a separate video. Uh, Also, hopefully, will get posted today. I'll do a review for you and try to. Chapter 3. I have my executive producer on the other side of the camera here making corrections as we go along. Wrap up chapter 3. Cognitive development. I think the last thing I talked about was creative thinking and what it meant to engage in divergent thinking, which would be an example of creativity or to think in novel ways. So we'll move on. The next PowerPoint screen is intelligence view, but I'm also following the order in the text, and on page 110, uh, metacognition is highlighted on this page, bold printed. So I think you should know what metacognition is. It's not anything I've talked about before this. So metacognition, the simplest way you might want to make a note to yourself is thinking about your thinking. So these are people who engage in thoughts about their thoughts. So it's another way of saying it is strategizing. So when you sit and think about how you're going to study for a test, you're engaging in metacognition as you're thinking about how you're going to arrange your thoughts and things like that. So it's thinking about thinking, okay? And that'll get you by. We're going to move to the section 4 on page 112, the psychometric intelligence view. Psychometrics is any type of testing and assessment and diagnostic work. But in this particular area of the text, we're only going to be talking about testing for IQ testing or intelligence quotient. So before I get too far into it, the question then is, well, how do we even measure intelligence? You know, what's an accurate way to decide a person's IQ? So the problem with it is that there's different people have different opinions about how to measure our IQ. Different cultures have different opinions. Here in America, we give you an IQ test, and that's acceptable. In some third world country, an IQ test probably doesn't mean much. They would want to know, can you survive? Can you adapt? Can you learn quickly, given your environment and your circumstances? And so they would measure if you were intelligent or not, maybe more from an adaptive. And so I think the best way to answer this question is it's at the end of the PowerPoint under intelligence view. The last statement says combine those two things. And if you combine those two things, you probably have the best overall way of measuring intelligence. And that's the ability to solve problems and to adapt and learn from your life experiences. So it's not just you have a volume of knowledge, you know vocabulary words, you know how to work math problems and that sort of thing, although that would be one of the major measurements. The other one is the ability to adapt or to think outside the box. For instance, if they were to show you a puzzle and you could put that puzzle together fairly quickly, that's not something you can study for or prepare for. You just have to be able to figure it out. Or if they use metaphors like a piece of glass is like your heart, or how is a metaphor, how is a piece of glass and your heart alike? Well, you can't study for something like that. So they want to see if you can come up with that type of thinking. And so that's probably the best way to measure intelligence. On page 113, and now I'm on the next page of the PowerPoint under intelligence view, talking about a guy named Binet. Alfred Binet, although he was involved in intelligence testing, what the author's talking about here in this chapter does not involve his participation in developing IQ tests, but rather a concept that he came up with. And so make sure you understand that I want you to focus on the concept that he came up with was called mental age. Mental age is the individual's level of mental abilities as compared to other people the same age or in the same age group. So in other words, what would we expect the average 5-year-old to know? How much knowledge, words, vocabulary, numbers, and things like that? What would the average 10-year-old know compared to other 10-year-olds, and so on, and 15-year-olds? So if a typical 5-year-old or 10-year-old or 15-year-old knew or had an average amount of knowledge about various subjects compared to all other people the same age, then his mental age would be pretty much average compared to all the other kids that same age. So that's really what it is. So if a kid, for instance, is 15 years old, chronological age, because we really have three ages. We have chronological age, we have mental age, and then we have social maturity age. Anyway, he works with the mental age and the chronological age. As long as your mental age and your chronological age match, then you are right where you should be and would be considered average, and nothing wrong with that. But let's say you had a mental age of 20 and you're a 16-year-old, so you know as much things as 20-year-olds know, then obviously your knowledge would be above average of other 16-year-olds. So just stick with mental age when you talk about Binet. And the reason I say it is because a little further down on the page, the discussion switches over to someone called William Stern. Now, William Stern took Binet's mental age, and he said, I think I can compute an intellectual or an intelligence quotient or an IQ score using this concept. So if you're asked about who came up with the formula to actually come up with IQ, then you're going to select William Stern. So I would memorize the formula at the very least. You may be asked to actually work a problem out, but I've given you an example there in the PowerPoint that says your IQ is equal to your mental age divided by your chronological age times 100. So it's pretty simple, really. If let's go back and let's follow the example I used a minute ago of a 16-year-old having a mental age of 20. And so when you reduce those numbers, if you follow my math example there, you're going to see this kid has an IQ of 125. The reason that's significant is because the average IQ of people is 100 when you do standardized testing. And so let's use an example of that. If the kid's 16 years old and he has a mental age of 16, when you reduce those 16 over 16 to 1 and multiply it times 100, that's what you get is 100. But in this case, like I told you, he has a mental age of 20 and he's a 16-year-old. Anytime your numerator is greater than your denominator, the answer to the IQ number is going to be greater than 100. And of course, the opposite would be true. If the denominator is greater and the kid is 20 years old but only has the knowledge base of a 16-year-old, then the number is going to fall below 100. So keep that in mind. And if the mental and the chronological match, it's going to be 100. You don't even have to do the math. So memorize the formula, and that may be sufficient, but be prepared if you need to compute one of the scores. Also, I'm just looking, following my own PowerPoint. It says that 68% of people's scores will fall within one standard deviation of the mean. Well, if you want to see that, it's figure 12 on page 113, and you'll see the shaded area in purple, and that the highest point, that's called the bell curve, and that highest point represents the average or the mean, meaning most people score of 100 on a test, with 34% falling one standard deviation below that, 34% above it, which equals 68% within one standard deviation. So when I talked about psychometrics and using that to do assessments and diagnostic work, what that's telling you is, for the most part in most diagnostic work, as long as you fall within one standard deviation above or below the average or mean, that is not significant. But if you look at that and you see the shaded blue areas as you move out from the mean, then that becomes more significant when you're trying to discuss a person's behaviors or IQ levels or needs for services and so on. So that's all that's telling you there. Uh, I want to talk about David Wechsler, and that's again still on page 113, the Wechsler scales. And by the way, the only person I'm going to probably question you about, because I see there's Gardner's and Sternberg's and so on. We're just going to do David Wechsler's IQ test because it's pretty popular today, and most IQ tests will just give you one score. You'll take a test and they'll say your IQ score is 118 or something. It really doesn't give you a lot of other information that would be very helpful because the test covers so many different things, but it doesn't break it down for you. Then you may have scored very high in one area and low in another area to get that average score. But Wechsler kind of addressed that, and he tried to address the testing you for your problem-solving skills, like I talked about, but also your adaptive skills. And so he breaks his test down into different domains. And so, for instance, he's going to test you what he calls your verbal scores, and that would be your problem-solving, vocabulary, word comprehension, and things like that. But then he also has a performance score, and that would be the adaptive. So that side of the testing would involve things like I told you with puzzles, reproducing symbols, looking at a picture and saying what it means, interpreting the meanings of things. And so what he does with that is he gives you 3 composite scores. Maybe that's the best term I can use with you because that's what the author uses, is composite. So you get a verbal score, you get a performance score, IQ scores. He averages those, and then you get a 3rd composite score, which is an overall IQ. And within that, he breaks it down into categories so you can get very specific and see where a person scored high or low in very specific areas, like they may have a high vocabulary score, but a low comprehensive score. So it helps when we're doing diagnostic work for special need kids or gifted kids in school and so on. Okay, so that takes care of Wechsler's scores. I want to go to heredity and environment on page 117, and that's again one of the PowerPoints that I'm sharing with you. What they're talking about here, if you go back to earlier discussion on behavior genetics and studying the impact of genetics and environment on various traits. Well, here they're doing that exact thing specifically about IQ. So one argument is that heredity or genetics is the strongest heritability index number for IQ because they come up with a number somewhere in the high 70s typically, and they use that as a strong correlation, if you will, to say that's a pretty good indication that our IQ is because of genetics, and I talked about that during the twin studies. But the bottom half of that page talks about environmental influences, and the argument here, and by the way, it's called the Flynn effect, F-L-Y-N-N. The Flynn effect says, wait a minute, when we tested people, and the simplest way to see this is on the next page in figure 17 on page 118, you're going to see not one bell curve, but 2 bell curves overlapping. The bell curve to the left was the Stanford-Binet test given in 1932 to a group of students showing the average score, again, like I told you, of 100. Well, in the second one is in 1997, if you're looking at your text. They gave that same test that they gave in 1932, same questions to a group of students in 1997, and you can see now the average, the mean moved up to 100 and looks like around 120, which is 1.5 standard deviations above what the young people back in the 30s made. Well, the argument here is there's no way that just over this short period of time somehow the young people today are that much more intelligent. Evolution wouldn't wouldn't be able to explain that in such a short period of time. So the argument for environment here is that technology, testing assisted, you can go to seminars, you can buy books, how to prepare, and all of that, the environmental things that are available to us have helped accelerate young people in the ability to take their IQ test and do well on a test. And so just keep that in mind, and that's the argument between whether it's genetics or environment, and of course we know it's probably a bit of both. The final section in this text, section 5, and we'll wrap this chapter up, is adolescent egocentrism. So we're talking about seeing things from your perspective and having a difficult time seeing things from other people's perspectives or point of view. Some people call that perspective taking. That's another whole discussion. Well, first off, the author just does a very broad discussion about egocentricity, and he divides it into two categories, and one is heightened self-consciousness. Heightened self-consciousness is when young people think that other people are as interested in them as they are in themselves. Simply put, if a young person has a pimple and they're very self-conscious about it, if they were walking down the hall and someone just looked at them and smiled, they would think that the person is holding back a laugh because they see that pimple, when in reality they're just telling them hi. They're not really that interested in your little pimple. So heightened self-consciousness is this sense that people are looking at them very closely. The other general identifying factor related to egocentricity is personal uniqueness, and that's that each young person feels that no one really fully understands what they're going through. They have this sense that they're the only one that has experienced this. So an example might be a young couple breaking up, and poor old Bubba, his heart is broken because Bubette just told him goodbye. And he just knows that no one knows the depth of his sorrow and how difficult life is for him now. And no one could possibly understand. And they call that personal uniqueness. Now, if you continue to read the paragraph below that, they mention David Elkind, E-L-K-I-N-D. David Elkind studied egocentricity in young people, and he looked at heightened self-consciousness, and he looked at personal uniqueness, and then he assigned terms to those things. So for personal uniqueness, let's take the first one, which is heightened self-consciousness. He calls that imaginary audience. So where he's coming from is that he says that these kids feel like they're on the stage all the time and the world is the audience. They're always looking at them. So if you see an example of a kid that's got some feature, their nose is too big in their mind, or they need their eyebrows waxed, some girl, then they think everybody's staring at them and they're on stage. So that's imaginary audience. The personal fable is related to personal uniqueness. The same thing applies as far as that sense of uniqueness and no one understands what you're going through. But the second half takes a bit of a twist, and that's the fable. A fable is just a made-up story. And so Elkind came to the conclusion that young people, in their desire to be unique and have a personal sense of identity unlike anyone else, they might even make up stories or fables. They would fabricate things. That's their own little story, almost like writing a novel and you're the main character, but it's all just made up or fictitious, but it's your story. And he called that personal fable. He goes on to say that kids who engage in personal fables and what we call personal uniqueness tend to take more risk, engage in risk-taking behavior. And by the way, egocentricity, if you had to pick one thing that it is correlated to, risk-taking, because they have a very difficult time seeing themselves being injured. They might say, well, I know you said this other kid got hurt doing this, but that wouldn't happen to me. The last thing that I know for sure I want you to pay attention to is that initially we had the opinion that egocentricity begins to fade as we move into adulthood. But the author, I think, especially Elkind, says that what they're finding at, and make a note of this, is that even in emerging adults, so we're talking about that young group of people, the emerging adults, that 18 to 20-something-year-old group that's still somewhat reliant on parents for support, also continue to be somewhat egocentric, not just adolescents. So egocentricity can span quite a number of years. As I thumb through, it looks like that's as far as I'm going to go in the chapter. I'm now on page 125, and that's the key term section. In the first column, I'm just going to call these out to you, and then I'll go into more detail in the review. But you might just make check marks or jot these words. I can assure you some of these will be on the test. In the first column, accommodation, the egocentrism, the amygdala, assimilation, attention, concrete operational stage, creativity, divergent thinking, and divided attention. In the second column, let's see, hypothetical deductive reasoning, intelligence, the intelligence quotient, the limbic system, and memory. In the third column, mental age, metacognition, normal distribution, the prefrontal cortex, the schema. In the last column, selective attention, wisdom, and zone of proximal development. Just below that, key people that you should be familiar with, aware of their concepts or their theories. David Elkind, which we just discussed. Second column, no one in the second column. Third column, William Perry, Piaget, and in the last column, Stern, Vygotsky, and Wechsler. So I think that's enough for right now. What I'll do a little later is hopefully before the day's over, I will be looking at the test and telling you where to focus a lot of your time and energy in preparing for the test, which we'll see on Wednesday, which I'll also use to compute your midterm grade, the 2 tests.